It was just after midnight, and Jacob and Sarah were halfway through their cross-country road trip. They'd been driving for hours on a desolate highway, surrounded by nothing but fields and forest stretching out into the darkness. Their fuel gauge was nearly empty, and when Jacob spotted a sign for a gas station 2 miles ahead, he breathed a sigh of relief. As they approached, a small gas station flickered into view, looking straight out of the 1960s, with a single rusty pump and a cracked neon sign that read "Gas Goods." They pulled in, and the station felt eerily deserted. An old weathered building sat under a single buzzing streetlight, and shadows pooled in every corner. "I guess it's better than running out of gas," Jacob muttered, grabbing his wallet. Sarah shivered, glancing around. "There's something off about this place, Jake. Let's be quick." Jacob got out and started pumping gas, while Sarah decided to check out the store and grab snacks. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, stepping inside. The place smelled of stale cigarettes and dust, and the shelves were stocked with faded, outdated products, things she hadn't seen in years, like glass bottles of cola and candy bars with retro packaging. An old radio in the corner crackled with static, cutting in and out with faint country music. A tall, gaunt man stood behind the counter, watching her intently as she wandered the aisles. His eyes were sharp and piercing, but his expression was blank, almost like he was waiting for something. Just getting a few snacks," Sarah said, forcing a smile as she grabbed a couple of candy bars. The man said nothing. He only continued to watch her, his gaze unsettling. She walked over to the counter, feeling the weight of his eyes on her. She tried to make small talk, but he only stared, his mouth forming a tight line. Finally she paid, took her things, and hurried outside, eager to get back to the car. When she stepped out, Jacob was still standing at the pump, but something was wrong. He looked like he was frozen in place. His eyes were wide, his face pale as he stared at the gas pump. "What's wrong?" she asked. But as she got closer, she saw it too. The gas pump. It wasn't connected to anything. The hose was frayed at the end, cut off like it hadn't been functional for years. Yet somehow the pump had been running and the meter showed they'd been charged for several gallons. "What the—" Jacob stammered, backing away. "This isn't right." They both looked around, and that's when they noticed. The lights on the station had dimmed, and the building looked different. The walls were more weathered, covered in vines and graffiti, the windows cracked. It was like the place had aged 50 years in the blink of an eye. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. They jumped back into the car, slamming the doors, and Jacob hit the gas. The station quickly disappeared in their rearview mirror as they sped off, neither of them daring to look back. They drove in silence for miles, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over them. But after about 20 minutes, the gas gauge dipped again, lower than ever. "No way," Jacob muttered. "I swear we just filled up." Desperate, they kept driving until, to their disbelief, they saw another sign for a gas station a few miles ahead. But as they got closer, their blood ran cold. It was the same station. They stared, slack-jawed, as the familiar cracked neon sign flickered in the darkness. The building was exactly the same. The rusty pump, the buzzing streetlight, even the gas goods sign hanging at an odd angle. They had somehow circled back, even though they had been driving in a straight line for miles. "Jake, did we make a wrong turn?" Sarah's voice shook. "No, we've just been going straight." His voice was barely a whisper, his face pale, as he pulled the car back into the station, too afraid to run out of gas in the middle of nowhere. They pulled up to the pump, and this time Jacob stayed in the car. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly, horribly wrong. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself, and stepped out, feeling every inch of the night pressing in around her. She made her way to the pump and hesitated before picking it up. Just as before, the end of the hose was frayed, hanging loosely with no sign of connection to an underground tank. But this time, she noticed something even stranger. On the side of the pump, scrawled in faded letters, was a message. "They're waiting for you inside." Sarah stumbled back, her heart pounding as she stared at the building. The store's windows were dark now, the faint outline of the tall man barely visible through the dusty glass, watching them, motionless. "Jake, we need to leave," she said, panic lacing her voice. "This place, it's not right. We have to get out of here, now." But when she looked back, Jacob wasn't in the car. His door was wide open, swinging slowly in the breeze. "Jake!" she screamed, her voice echoing into the silent night. She ran around the car, her eyes frantically scanning the darkness, but he was gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Desperately, she looked back at the building, and her heart stopped. Standing in the doorway was Jacob, his face expressionless, his eyes hollow, like he was in a trance. Beside him stood the tall man from the counter, his hand resting heavily on Jacob's shoulder. "Jake!" Sarah cried, but he didn't respond. He simply stared at her, unblinking. As the man tightened his grip on his shoulder, a twisted smile spreading across his face. Without thinking, she bolted back to the car, slamming the door and fumbling with the keys, her hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and as she glanced in the rearview mirror, she saw them both, the man and Jacob, watching her from the entrance of the store, their figures slowly fading into the darkness. She sped off down the highway, her heart racing, tears streaming down her face. She drove for hours, not stopping until the sun rose and she finally reached the edge of a small town. She stumbled into a diner, barely able to speak as she told the waitress what had happened. The woman's face paled, and she glanced around nervously before speaking. "That station," she whispered, leaning in close. "It burned down over 40 years ago. Folks say it was haunted. Some people see it. But once you stop there, you don't come back the same." Sarah left the town that same day, never looking back. She drove the rest of her route in daylight only, avoiding gas stations at night, haunted by the memory of Jacob's hollow eyes and the twisted smile of the man who had taken him. To this day, she never found any trace of him. It was as if he had simply disappeared into the night, along with the ghostly gas station that kept calling them back, over and over again. It was late October, and Mike and Lisa were on a long road trip, cutting through the back roads to save time. They were planning to camp near a scenic mountain spot by sunrise, but with only a flashlight and a map, they were now hopelessly lost. The area had no cell service and their car's GPS had long given out. Thick trees surrounded the narrow road, and fog made the night feel dense, swallowing the headlights into a wall of white. After hours of driving in circles, Mike spotted a figure walking along the road. It was a young woman wearing a red hoodie, her hood pulled up so they couldn't see her face. She was facing away from them, her thumb out in a hitchhiker's gesture. Normally, Mike and Lisa would have ignored hitchhikers, but something about the isolated, foggy landscape made the sight feel strangely out of place. After a brief debate, they agreed to pull over. As Mike rolled down the window, the girl turned slowly to face them. Her skin was deathly pale, and her eyes seemed sunken, like she hadn't slept in days. Her expression was empty, void of emotion, as if she were a mannequin brought to life. Without saying a word, she opened the back door and got in, her eyes locked on something far away. Lisa felt a chill go down her spine, and Mike's hand shook as he put the car in gear. "Where are you headed?" Lisa asked, trying to sound casual, but the girl said nothing. She sat silently, her face half hidden by the hoodie, hands resting stiffly on her lap. After several long minutes of silence, Mike glanced into the rearview mirror and noticed something strange. The girl's reflection was blurry, like a smudge on the glass. His heart began to race. "So, been out here long?" He tried, but she remained silent, her gaze unfocused and distant. The silence grew heavier, pressing down on them like the fog outside, and then barely above a whisper, the girl finally spoke. "You shouldn't be out here," she said, her voice hollow and cold. "It's dangerous." Mike and Lisa exchanged a glance, feeling the weight of her words settle over them. Lisa forced a nervous smile, trying to shake off the growing unease. "Yeah, we just got a little lost." The girl turned her head slowly to look at them, and Mike caught her eye in the mirror. Her pupils were unnaturally wide, swallowing up the light, giving her an almost otherworldly appearance. "Not lost," she whispered. "Not yet." The silence returned, even heavier this time. Every so often Mike would steal a glance in the mirror, but every time he looked, the girl seemed closer, her face just a little clearer, like she was inching forward without actually moving. His skin prickled, and a deep sense of dread washed over him. After about 10 minutes of driving through the thick fog, Lisa finally broke the silence. "Is there somewhere specific we should drop you off?" she asked, forcing cheerfulness. The girl tilted her head slightly. "Just ahead, where the road ends." Lisa frowned. "The road ends?" But as they turned a corner, they saw it, a dead end, barricaded with rusted metal fencing, overgrown with ivy. The road simply stopped. Mike hit the brakes, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel. He turned to ask the girl if this was really her stop, but when he looked back, the seat was empty. Lisa gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. The girl had vanished. Mike stepped out of the car, looking around, calling out into the fog, but there was no sign of her. The forest was silent, watching. They both got back in the car, rattled and speechless. Mike turned the key, but the engine sputtered and died. He tried again. Nothing. They were stuck. Then from somewhere in the fog came the faint sound of humming. It was soft and eerie, like a lullaby drifting through the trees. It was her voice, the girl's voice, growing louder, getting closer. The hairs on the back of Mike's neck stood on end as he turned the key over and over again, desperately trying to start the car. The humming grew louder until it was right next to them, right by the window. They looked, and there she was, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes dark and empty, her mouth curled into a sinister grin. In one last frantic attempt, Mike turned the key, and this time the engine roared to life. He hit the gas, the tires spinning on the wet road, and the car shot forward, leaving the dead end and the girl in the fog behind them. They didn't stop driving until they were miles away, and the morning sun was finally peeking over the horizon. They didn't speak of it again, but from that day on, they avoided the back roads. But sometimes, late at night, Mike would look in the rearview mirror and swear he saw a flash of red, a girl in a hoodie, sitting in the back seat, waiting for them to reach another dead end. Sam and Jordan had been driving through the mountains for hours, winding along narrow roads as they made their way to a cabin they'd rented for a weekend getaway. The sun had set hours ago, and they were the only ones on the lonely road, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to press in on them, casting strange shadows in the moonlight. As the clock struck midnight, they reached a stretch of road that looked unfamiliar. The GPS had lost signal a while back, but Jordan was confident they were heading in the right direction. But with each turn, Sam grew more uneasy. The headlights only pierced a few feet into the darkness, and the silence felt thick, almost suffocating. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Sam asked, her eyes flicking nervously to the dark forest on either side. "Pretty sure," Jordan replied, though his voice sounded less certain. After another few miles, Sam noticed something odd in the rearview mirror. There was a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the road behind them, barely visible in the moonlight. She couldn't make out any details, but it looked like a person, tall and still. "Did you see that?" Sam asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" Jordan asked, glancing at her, confused. She shook her head, unsure if her mind was playing tricks on her. "Never mind. It's probably nothing." They continued driving, but a few minutes later Sam's eyes drifted back to the mirror, and there it was again. The figure was closer this time, just on the edge of the taillights, as if it had moved without them noticing. It was still too far to make out any details, but its presence was unmistakable. Her heart raced, and she gripped the seat. "Jordan, I think someone's following us," she said, her voice shaky. He glanced at her, then quickly checked the rearview mirror himself. "I don't see anything." But Sam couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, that creeping sense of dread. She kept her eyes on the mirror, half expecting the figure to appear again. And it did. This time it was even closer, almost at the back of the car. She could see the vague outline of a head, shoulders, and arms, but its face was obscured, as if it were cloaked in shadows. "Jordan, it's right there," she whispered, almost in a panic. Jordan looked back again, frowning. "There's nothing there, Sam. You're probably just tired." "It's late." But Sam knew she wasn't imagining it. She could feel it, a cold, unsettling presence creeping up her spine. She tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead, but every time she glanced back, the shadow was closer, edging into the light of the rearview mirror, slowly, deliberately. Then, in the silence, a soft thud sounded from the roof of the car. Sam gasped, her eyes widening as she looked at Jordan. "You heard that, right?" Jordan nodded, his face pale. "Probably a branch or something," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. The thud came again, louder this time, like something heavy pressing down on the roof. Jordan pressed the gas, speeding up, hoping to shake off whatever it was, but the faster they went, the louder the noise grew, now accompanied by a soft scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. Sam's heart pounded as she tried to keep her breathing steady. "Just keep going," she whispered, gripping the seat. They rounded a bend, and for a moment, Sam dared to hope the noise would stop. But just as quickly the scraping grew louder, now coming from the back window. Slowly she turned to look, and froze. The shadowy figure was pressed against the glass, its face hidden, but she could feel its gaze piercing through the darkness. It had no eyes, no mouth, just an endless void where a face should have been. But somehow, she knew it was staring at her. Sam clutched Jordan's arm, barely able to speak. "Jordan, it's here." He didn't look, just kept driving, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. "Don't look at it," he whispered. "Just don't look." They sped down the road, and the figure stayed with them, its shadowy face inches from the glass. Sam squeezed her eyes shut, praying it would go away, that it was all just a nightmare she would wake up from. But when she opened her eyes, it was still there, closer than ever, almost pressing against the glass, as if trying to reach inside. Finally, they saw a light up ahead, a roadside motel, its flickering neon sign a beacon in the darkness. Without a second thought, Jordan pulled into the parking lot and slammed on the brakes. They both jumped out of the car, stumbling toward the motel entrance, too afraid to look back. Inside, the motel was dimly lit and silent, with a single attendant behind the counter. He raised an eyebrow as they burst in, wide-eyed and breathless. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone casual. Sam and Jordan exchanged a glance, still catching their breath. "There was someone following us," Jordan said, his voice shaking. The attendant's expression darkened. "On this road? That's not surprising. Folks say there's a spirit that haunts these parts, a shadow that appears in the rearview mirror following travelers until they stop." Sam shivered, glancing back at their car, which now looked empty and still in the parking lot. "It usually doesn't bother people who stay here, though," the attendant added, his eyes narrowing. "But sometimes it leaves something behind." They exchanged a nervous look, but after a long night of driving, exhaustion won out. They decided to get a room, hoping that a few hours of sleep would shake off the terror of what they'd just experienced. In the morning, they returned to the car, hesitant but determined to continue their trip. But as Sam climbed into the passenger seat, she froze, a chill spreading through her as she looked in the rearview mirror. In the dim reflection, a shadowy figure sat in the back seat, perfectly still, waiting.